Now, many shelters for abused women face closure or may be forced to reduce their services. Researchers believe the reason for this is that government's funding model is inadequate, leaving most homes underfunded. Now, a group of organizations have now released a report proposing a more equitable funding model. One of the authors of the report, Lisa Vetten from Wits University, joins us now. Perhaps before we get to your set of recommendations, just paint a picture for us as to just how dire the situation is. In other words, the sort of things that these organizations are unable to do any longer.
Well, most of them can't provide services to children, and that's really important. And providing services to children is really important. We've got lots and lots of research that shows that children who witness domestic violence are also themselves often exposed to it, but they're at great risk of themselves growing up to be perpetrators or victims, again, of violence. So by not giving money to be able to intervene effectively with children, you're just allowing for the ongoing perpetuation of domestic violence. That was the one problem. The other problem was we found that some shelters were being expected to feed their residents on 9 Rand a day. Who can buy a meal for anybody at 9 Rand a day? And then we also found a number of shelters didn't have staff who were able to provide the full range of services, so they didn't have social workers, for instance. Some of the shelters were being run purely on volunteers who were receiving stipends of 600 Rand a month. Even though those people are clearly not volunteers, they're working on a full-time basis. So you can't, by law, be paying them stipends. But that, again, is a consequence of the Department of Social Development's particular funding model. So we found violations in really of labour law and labour rights in terms of the subsidies that are being paid, and just a general inadequacy of services to women that quite possibly could violate their rights.
But the drying up of funds, has been going on for quite a while. And what should be done now?
There are a couple of things. Part of the problem is that, if you look at the Department of Social Development's funding, 88% of it goes to the payment of social grants, 10% goes to social welfare services. And of social welfare services, you've got about 10 to 12 different programs. The Victim Empowerment Program, which provides the funding towards shelters, gets the least amount of money within those programs. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem, and this goes to directly what Minister Tito Mboweni was saying last week, is that as the government wage bill has increased, what it's done is it's shrunk the money to go to transfers for NPOs. So government salaries have been doing that, while services have been doing that. There's also been no thinking or policy development in the area of shelters for the last 14 years. So they've just been left to stagnate. So it's not really that there isn't enough money, it's how the money is being used and what the level and quality of thinking that's going into how we design a shelter service that's the problem.
So do you think then, which is why I started by asking that question, that if those who matter, or the people who have to take the decisions, their minds, their hearts and minds are not at the right place. No matter what suggestion you may give them or formula, you may give them to say, do this instead of that, that's most likely to fall on deaf ears, isn't it?
Very likely. And I think we have, and this is not a recent problem, it's a decades-long problem of seeing welfare services being soft issues. And in fact, if you look, since 1983, and this is predominantly a very feminized sector, so I think this is also a gender equality matter, you'll see that a lot of the women who've worked in this have been cut out of labour legislation. They have been excluded from the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which does tell you a lot about the value and rights that government places on this. So I'm hoping that, we have this gender-based violence summit at the end of the week. We have a president who says he wants to do something about gender-based violence. Here's his opportunity.
Well, at the risk of pouring cold water on your suggestions, do you really think that what you're putting on the table now will, find resonance, among your ministers?
Well, the thing is, Voya, is if it doesn't, then I think one will resort to litigation. One has already seen this happening in the Free State, where the High Court there said that the financing policy being used by the Department of Social Development is unconstitutional. It doesn't meet the progressive realization of rights that the Constitution demands. So, one can do what one can, but if we're not going to get a response, then we do have to look at ensuring that rights are met, including if that means litigation.
What do other countries or jurisdictions that have similar problems to those we are experiencing in this country, what do they do what do they do better than us to deal more effectively with the kinds of challenges we have to face?
Well, I think most people start with some kind of rational funding model. They'll sit down and say, what does it cost to house a woman and her children every single day? What food should we spend, toiletries, etc., etc.? We don't have such a model, which was why we did this research. So what that means is that if you work in the Free State, you'll get 200,000 Rand a year for your shelter. If you're based here in Gauteng, you'll get 1.1 million. So, there's nothing rational about this. In fact, it's a source of inequality because with women are in the Free State or in Gauteng, they're still being abused. They need the same quality of service. And when you pay inequitably, you're clearly creating inequality. So what we should be doing as a first step is saying, this is a rational funding policy. This is what it costs. This is how we as government are over the next year, 3 years, 5 years, going to move towards it. This is where we will look at the funding. Because whatever the difficulties of our fiscus right now, there is money. It's how we're choosing to spend it that's the problem.
But do they have very specific things in their, for lack of a better word or description, architecture that sort of allows these conversations to be there all the time, but also that allows them to actually, whenever there's something that goes on. You're saying that our laws haven't been looked at in the past, 40 years?
The policy.
Presumably they too have academics and NGOs like we have, but is there something else that they have that we don't have, which may just
Yes. If I look at some of the other countries, what they've also thought about is how do we link housing to shelters? Because women can't live in shelters forever. So they've linked shelters to housing. They've also linked women to job and income opportunities, because many women who go into shelters are economically dependent. They don't have those opportunities. So they've tried to think in comprehensive and holistic ways. Some countries also obviously have a better developed welfare system than we do, which is a strength. But nonetheless, we could be doing much more given the history of where we have come from and what resources we do have.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much for coming through.